A very good morning to all of you. On behalf of the Department of English, Uluberia College, I welcome you all on the second day of this web lecture series organized by Department of English and in collaboration with the IQAC of Uluberia College. The sole purpose of organizing this web lecture series is the benefit of our students. We are fortunate enough that we have been able to acquire some time from the busy schedule of some of the most eminent academicians in the field of English literature. I'm sure our students will be benefited from these valuable lectures. Today, for the first session of the second day of our web lecture series, we have with us Professor Sabuj Sarkar from University of Gour, Banga. We welcome you, sir. Welcome. It is an honor
Thank you
for
so
all of
much.
us to have you here as our resource person today and to listen to your thought provoking lecture on urbanity, isolation, and boredom, rereading Elliots' The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Preludes. Quoting Eliot, I would like to say only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. So, I think here is an opportunity for our students to delve deeper and find out how far Sir can take us with Eliot. I would request my colleague Debolinath Baborta ma'am to give our esteemed speaker's introduction. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah. Uh, Thank you. Thank you so much. The Department of English, Uluberia College welcomes you once again, sir. A very good morning. And it gives me immense pleasure to introduce Professor Sabuj Sarkar, Assistant Professor, Gour University, Malda. We are meeting, sir, after a long time in an absolutely different phase. Last we met, I think,
Different
in
context.
2016. Yeah.
Yes.
Whom I do know not only as a wonderful teacher, but also as a wonderful person as well. He has been teaching since the year 2009. So far, he has attended and presented papers in a considerable number of national and international level seminars. His areas of interest include folk studies, culture studies, and green studies. He writes poems in English and Bengali. He edited volume of Bengali poems, that is Joldorchi, that has been published this year, 2020. He is the founding editor of Meghodambor, a literary magazine of folk issues. Recently, he is working on an anthology of English poems, Alos. Today, he is going to deliver his lecture on urbanity, isolation, and boredom, rereading T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Preludes. So we are eagerly waiting, and our students are eagerly waiting to listen to you. So it's over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to the HOD of English Department, Uluberia College, and all the faculty members of English Department, and also IQAC, as the program is being jointly organized in collaboration with IQAC of the same college, to the principal and all the stakeholders of the college. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some moments with students. Since the introductory section, it's very clear that primarily the kind of lecture series is organized for the purpose of the students, for their benefit. So I will be homely enough, addressing students particularly, and will be less scholarly, but at the same time we'll try to make a kind of a balance in between. So I'm starting my talk today. So as Professor Debolina Baborta has already declared the topic, the title of my talk today, Urbanity, Isolation, and Boredom, rereading Elliott's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Preludes. So first of all, there is a kind of a, no doubt, a personal emotions the time we are passing right now. I find a different kind of feelings this particular phase of pandemic and confinement, because the kind of seminar, the lecture, the talk we are organizing right now is everyone is in their own space. And since the whole thing is getting virtually, so we are no doubt isolated during the whole phase of this lockdown period. And the boredom concept that I will go for later on and would like to start here before I start Eliot. At first, we had the kind of long cherished ambition or a kind of a desire, I rather say, when the next Sunday would come and we can have a quality time with our family. But as we see, when every day is a Sunday now, it becomes a kind of a different feeling, different thought, different perspective now. When to come out of that very boredom. You are spending every day, and every day is a Sunday, and you have the kind of activity you had earlier. We are all trying to make a kind of an activity through virtually. Still, the kind of job, the kind of everyday engagement we had, the kind of sharing of ideas in our practical field we had, it's now getting a different one. The early desire to have a Sunday is now the everyday Sunday. So we would like to overcome this one. So keeping all those boredom in mind, isolation in mind, and repetitions in mind, and when I was offered the series of texts out of which I can select any one of them, then I selected Eliot and the kind of topic urbanity, isolation, and boredom. Now, as I have already said, the lecture will be addressed to the student. Now, Eliot was a kind of a poet who had continuously later in his life, since when he was the kind of not the poet, rather the thinker, rather the kind of essayist, and his theory of impersonality. I am starting with the impersonality theory because Eliot wanted to dissociate the piece of writing written by a poet and the poet himself. And he deliberately preached for the kind of dissociation, one from the other. But interestingly, when we read the love song of Alfred Proofwork and Preludes, and not the Wasteland right now, because that's not the topic of today's talk, I find that when I read the love song of Alfred Proofwork and my recent readings of these two poems once again, because I love these two poems so much, I find that these two poems talk a lot about the poet himself, the poet's personal experiences, the poet's personal journey. And these two poems, and particularly this kind of this section, I am not including the Wasteland here. I find that these are the poems which are the results of that struggling poet, who is continuously searching for a voice of his own. And to have a voice of his own, he is actually moving to and fro, leaving his hometown in America and then moving for Europe, spending so many places. So I am moving for that. So to move for this journey of T.S. Eliot as a poet, and to go later on to the poems, the love song of Alfred Proofwork and the Preludes, I have taken help from Russell Elliott Murphy, a scholar, of course, an Eliot scholar, and his text. Russell Elliott Murphy's text talks a lot about some of the significant aspects of Eliot's life. And if we read Murphy, then we can easily connect how or in what particular way the issues and the elements of boredom, isolation came in the thinking process of Eliot gradually. Now, the kind of family has always been given importance to in Eliot's thoughts, his letters, his writings, in his poems, in his essays. And he always has given importance to that. For a poet, family is necessary. It doesn't mean that every poet must have a very good family, but the influences of family, uh, the kind of nurturing mind that a family can offer to an aspiring poet, that is very much necessary. And it is all about family that actually uh, can predict or actually can move someone what kind of a creative artist or a writer he must be in future. Now Murphy is there to identify some of the valuable facts that Eliot's position in the family was something very difficult one, I must say, because he was the seventh of all the children of that Eliot family, and the last one. Youngest one was T.S. Eliot, and he was the seventh one. So, being the youngest one, of course, is a different kind of position. And the kind of position that I must say is that he was always under the kind of guidance, a kind of through the scrutinized eyes, he was the kind of an object all the time of his parents, no doubt, and by the elders on the other hand. And seventh and the last child, if that is one kind of position that Eliot experienced in his St. Louis, Missouri. And on the other hand, that is another important aspect was that he was a kind of a late child. Eliot was a late child of his parents. So what is interesting here is that this very position in his family and in the society in general, that Eliot actually was growing up in St. Louis, Missouri. I quote from Murphy here. I think that will be more interesting. Growing up in that vibrantly active community along the fabled Mississippi River would remain an experience that would shape Eliot's poetry and acute sense of place well into his advancing years. Now, Eliot could never get himself away from that very acute sense of place. Those sense of place will come repeatedly. And of course, in four quartets, the uh, wonderful philosophical poem, Four Quartets, where we find the very sense of acute sense of place, going back to the past and get connected to the past all the time. And the beginning and the end, that very circular motion, we find Eliot is all the time is trying to make a kind of a circle of life, and the journey that he is all the time trying to kind of binding them up. The dry salvages composed during the height of World War II in the summer of 1940, that begins with the famous image of a river that is unmistakably the Mississippi, a strong brown god. So Mississippi comes in his mind as a strong brown god. I unquote Murphy. So this Eliot is actually cannot dissociate himself. Of course, he's talking a lot about that theory of impersonality, but as a reader, we are always there to go back to that very past of Eliot. What I find in Eliot is a kind of that vibrantly active community, that community in which he was actually growing up. In so many materials on Eliot that I have consulted so far is that this vibrant, active community had two different impressions on the young poet, young mind of T.S. Eliot. First of all, that he had a luxury of life because his family was very well to do and successful, financially sound. But at the same time, isolation was very much there. The kind of isolation we find in the case of Rabindranath Tagore. And if we read Tagore, we find, if we read his collection of memoirs, Jibon Sriti, we definitely identify the kind of isolation. And isolation, I think, is very much necessary to be a poet, to be a creative writer later on, because this moment of isolations helped him to collect some of those elements of life and to revision them, becoming a kind of a visionary later on. And that Eliot, of course, was successful in that way. The way Tagore also, jotted down all those loneliness and isolations of life, growing up under the care of a, domestic help, and not even the help of his mother even, because only in Jibon Sriti we find Tagore used to get the opportunity to meet their mother only when they were ill. Otherwise they had to stay alone and under the guidance of all those domestic helps. So vibrantly active community was, of course, no doubt, in one hand, a kind of a feeling of importance, a kind of a very active life. On the other hand, Eliot's childhood was very much isolated in that sense that the kind of local association, the meeting with the other boys, such kind of experiences we don't find in that way available. Rather, he had to spend a kind of a, you know, um, alone, very much alone. In another part of Murphy's text that I have already mentioned, that he was a kind of a late child. So Murphy is giving emphasis to this kind of a particular point, because when Eliot was growing up, uh, his parents were already, they have crossed 40s, and other siblings, they were already grown up. So naturally, there was a kind of a gap among the siblings, because Eliot and those who came earlier than him, the kind of mental association they had. In case of Eliot, in spite of being in the same family, he was, growing up, being isolated, being alone, and so these very feelings are very much there in him since his childhood days. Now, as urbanity is one of the sections of our talk today, I must try to connect urbanity and the city life that Eliot had in mind, because the kind of cities, the kind of places where Eliot actually, spent his different phases of life, no doubt helped him to collect the essential data to write poems like this. And at the same time, when we think of urbanity, when we think of the urban planning, I have taken help from John Montgomery's article, Making a City, Urbanity, Vitality, and Urban Design. And in this interesting article by John Montgomery, it emphasizes on the psychology of place. And the long article of Montgomery refers to Alexander Lynch and so many urban theorists that deals primarily with the notion of mental map. So a city is nothing but a reflection of mental maps. And through city, what does the people who reside there, what do they get? They get a kind of an internal guidance. So city and the people, there is such an interesting connection. And the kind of city we are staying right now, I cannot detach myself all through, because I am making a kind of a connection all the time, the kind of city I am in. So it was in Montgomery's article, I will go back to once again, in which the primarily a city, when it is made, it offers certain agenda. What are the agenda that a city planner, designer make actually? There must be safety, comfort, vibrance, quiet environment, And another very interesting word that I find in the definition of that very city design, urban design, you know, it is often threatening, threat from city. So it doesn't mean that a city will welcome everyone. Uh, I would like to go back to another one of my favorite essayists, Elizabethan essayists, Renaissance man, who is no other than Francis Bacon. In Bacon's essay uh, of friendship, so far I do remember right now, there was that very famous line: "A big city, that means big loneliness." The kind of city that the larger it will be, the larger it will be, it will have its loneliness. People will be isolated. A very close one, you know each and everyone very well. The more the city will be developed and larger one, so no one knows who is there. So this very, loneliness, larger city, it also offers not only comfort, safety, vibrance, quietness, but also a kind of a threat that uh, it offers a kind of a loneliness, of course. Another city theorist, Peter Buchanan. I would like to take help from Buchanan's ideas on the city and urban lifestyle and the philosophy. That Buchanan was there to say urban design is essentially about placemaking, where places are not just a specific space, but all the activities and events which made it possible. So it generally thinks that a city and urban design is something where everything is possible, but it is not like that. It is not like that. It has some other dimensions too, and no doubt it is physical space, and Montgomery also dividing space, the city space, in three different sections: the physical space, the sensory experience, and the activity. In Elliott's writing, when he talks about city life, when he talks about urbanity, he not only talks about the physical space, he also talks about the sensory experience. He talks about that very activity. And I have in front of me the love song of Geoffrey Proofwork. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust, restaurant with western shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument. I would like to emphasize here to my listeners, half-deserted streets, tedious argument, insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. I skip the yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back, and shoot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. So this very, society, the culture, the life, the cheap hotels, these are not only, according to Montgomery, the kind of three divisions of a city: physical space, the sensory experience, and activity. So in case of Eliot, no doubt it was very much a kind of a sensory experience, the kind of description, the kind of lines we find in the love song of Geoffrey Proofwork. Now, I was referring to the family, and Eliot could never dissociate himself from family because crisis came in his life all the time. He faced crisis in different phases of his life. And these two poems, interestingly, were written in a time when Eliot was in the most crisis period, because a man who is struggling to find the tune of his own. I find in another material that some of the connection between history, family, and how this history, past, and the family are well connected in Eliot's Over. In Eliot, we find how family, country, his civilization, his race, and the ways in which the past constantly impinges on the present and the present on the future. And there is always a sense of, very important word, there is always a sense of relocation and dislocation in his poems. So always relocate. These two poems, the love song of Geoffrey Pufok and Preludes, 4 sections are there. We find that it is not always Missouri, it is not always St. Louis, it is not always London. You know, London, Paris, St. Louis, America, all are superimposed. All are well connected in such a way we cannot fix it up. We cannot say directly, this is the description of London, this description of Paris. He visited so many places, and now out of the his experience of visiting so many places, all those experiences of a city life, squalor, humdrum life, all are rolled into one in such a brilliant way that now it is difficult to dissociate one from the other. So this sense of relocation and the sense of dislocation we find there in Eliot's poems. And Eliot is continuously, in his poems, we find the sense of oozing out. He's actually, making kind of delivering these very emotions which are gradually coming out from his poetic persona. In 1919, Eliot wrote a letter to his brother Henry, and I will just read out only one sentence from that letter that he wrote to his brother Henry. And that one line, one sentence, I think that is an eye-opener for we all the Eliot lovers. One remains always a foreigner, even in his own place, even in London, even in Paris. That sense of being a foreigner, it was attached to that very psyche of T.S. Eliot all the time. And he remained a foreigner all through. Of course, being an American, he settled in London, and also once upon a time wanted to settle down in Paris for long. But this observation, this introspection that came to him later in his life and thought and ideas, one remains always a foreigner. It was never ever gone. Rather, it was with him all the time. And in all the writings of Eliot, we find this very sense of being a foreigner was very much there. These two poems, as we are talking about, the love song of Geoffrey Pufok and the another one is Preludes, actually early poems, even when that poetic personality was not fully matured. He was in his 20s, almost 28, and started writing the poem when he was in his 22nd age. It took a long time. Eliot probably didn't want to publish the poem early, because he was not finding a definite voice of his own. And that's why he was honing the skill of writing in so many ways. Eliot spent the summer uh, soon after his graduation from Harvard in June 1910 in Gloucester, and then he convinced his family members. And by this time, he also applied for a kind of a travel, fellowship, and he went to Paris for 10 months and was in Paris there uh, just after his 22nd birthday. And now this very sojourn to Paris, I must say, was something that groomed the young Eliot's mind that we find later in the poems. And he continuously was honing the sentences, rectified, modified. And this very short visit, no doubt, in Paris, the moral, the religious, the intellectual structure, and he met so many intellectuals there, attending classes, lectures, and we know that in Sorbonne, Eliot took classes in French literature and read continuously. Now, I would like to talk a little bit of Eliot's vast reading, because not only these two poems, rather all the poems, and particularly the Wasteland, such brilliant texts reflect that the kind of vast reading that Eliot had. And Eliot started the vast reading since his childhood days, and he had a brilliant, training in classical text. Even when he was in Harvard, and before that, in his school days, his vast reading in the classical text, and later on, the huge study, the mammoth task that he did, reading all the philosophers, not only his particular Bradley's work, because the subject of his PhD, this very vast reading actually developed Eliot in a different way. So Eliot took the French classes in Sorbonne, and not only he read a lot about French literature, but also he was actually grooming himself in philosophies and different kind of philosophical thoughts and ideas. And I would like to mention here, he also attended the lectures of College de France, and then there was the famous, renowned idealist philosopher Henry Bergson. So Eliot attended that brilliant lectures by the philosopher Henry Bergson. So Henry Bergson influenced him a lot in different ways, and we find the reflections of Henry Bergson in the poetic style of Eliot, not only in Love Song of Joe Alfred Proofwork and Preludes. An article by Elizabeth Gross, the name of the article, Deleuze, Bergson, and the Concept of Life. I find some interesting facts about Bergson, and those Bergsonian thoughts are no doubt well reflected in the philosophy of life that you find in Eliot. I quote from the article of Gross. Bergson develops a new concept of life that he has remade as his own. Bergson is the most Darwinian of the philosophers. For Darwin, life is the consequence of actions and passions. The actions of individual variation and sexual selection, and the passion, the passivity of natural selection. The peristaltic forces of cohesion and disintegration. For Bergson, life is that which dynamizes within the beyond itself the forces of matter by suffusing the material present the actual with the virtuality of memory. It is the accumulation of the past simultaneously with the movement of the present that brings with it the necessity of invention, newness, of future not contained in the present. So this very concept of dynamism, virtuality of memory, I find very much in the love song of Alfred Prufrock. I read that very, individual variation that the article was saying we find in case of Bakso and the sexual selection, because it is an undeniable fact that there is, if we read the love song of Alfred Prufrock, we find the kind of sexual deprivation on the poetic persona. The speaker in the poem is somehow sexually frustrated. That is very much there, and that very isolation, and the reflection also we find in the Wasteland. In Wasteland, we find that Eliot is referring to some Ecclesiastes and the biblical text that marriage is a kind of a factor that can mitigate the desire, the lust. So to have a balanced mind, how marriage is necessary, the kind of references are mentioned in the Wasteland. In the third section, we find how that burning desire, the fire images are very much there, and how to mitigate. Eliot is constantly referring to some of the Ecclesiastes and other references, and the reference to Buddhism also, Buddhist text, and how to get that very solution. We find that the poetic persona, the kind of speaker in love song of Alfred Prufrock is always troubled, because there is a kind of an tedious argument in his mind all the time, because he questions so many. He is arguing all the time, and those argumentation is not with someone else. Rather, the argumentations are always internal argumentations. In line number 12 of the poem, we find, to lead you to an overwhelming question, oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. And this very frustration, sexual frustration, and these very tedious questions are there all through the poem. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. We find the visions and the revisions in the lines of the love song of Alfred Prufrock. Again, in line number 35 and 36, we find that these very two lines are repeated. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Now, this internal process of argumentation, that memory, that dynamics of life, we find the speaker is asking himself, do I dare time to turn back and descend the stair? And now, almost 40 plus minus age, later I will refer to once again how Eliot himself is mentioning that Prufrock is a kind of a man who says he's almost 40 and he is alone, isolated in a very dull and drab city life. And now the man is, psychic in his mind, with a bald spot in the middle of my hair, and the man is having less hair, thin hair, and there is a kind of a sense of questioning. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. So there is always a questioning, there is always a kind of a sense of doubt in Proofwork, what the other will say, what the other will ask. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute, there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. I have known them all, already known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with the dying fall beneath the music from a further room. So, how should I presume? I have known the eyes already, known them all, because Proofwork has no such kind of courage to see the eyes of the society women. Eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. When I am formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all but ends of my days and ways? How should I presume? I have known the arms already, known them all, arms that are braceleted, white and bare, but in the lamplight, donned in the light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie along a table or a wrap about a shawl, how should I then presume? How should I begin? This very doubt, anxiety, questioning, how should I begin? How should I presume? So it is always there. And Proofwork can never dissociate, that very society man, that very city man, representative of that city man. And Proofwork is not one. So many Proofworks are there. So this is how in Eliot we find a kind of a new poet, because Eliot is also struggling at the same time. I refer to the new voice he was searching for. 10 to 11 months he spent in Paris, and that was very crucial in Eliot's life. And he was training himself up in so many ways. He turned his hand to perfecting the poems in the symbolist style, and he was then reading the symbolist poet, voraciously. And these poems like Rhapsody on a Windy Night, Preludes, were not that he wrote in Paris actually. Those were the results of his undergraduate days, but he was actually honing. When he went to Paris and read some of the symbolist poet there, he found that, okay, so that was that very best ever time to honing all those, lines and thoughts and ideas that he has started writing already. And the composing of the love song of J. Alfred Proofwork, at the same time, the portrait of a lady. These poems were actually started around early 1910, but these were not complete. Rather, Eliot's experiences of Paris actually enriched him so many ways that he was trying to redefine them, trying to rewrite them in a new fashion. And then we know that in November 1911, he was back to America. But there he met a man. And we know the man is no other than J. Vardanel, a young Frenchman with whom he had a brilliant friendship. But we know there was a kind of a sorry event that Vardanel was a student of medicine, and they shared the room. And both of them were a lover of poetry. And Vardanel himself also used to write poems. But later he became a doctor and went to the military doctor he was. And during the World War I, Vardanel died during the World War I. So this very long-term friend, though they had not so much direct connection, but a kind of a connection was there. It was more mental, psychological connection, a kind of a bond that Eliot felt for J.F. Vardanel all the time. But when he came to know about the death of Vardanel, it was a kind of a great shock for him. And we know the collection, Proofwork and Other Observations. In 1917, this collection was dedicated to this very friend, J.F. Vardanel. Uh, 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 no doubt so many rumors are there regarding the friendship between J. Vardanel and Eliot, but I am not going to that kind of rumors, popular rumors, or even someone may prove that okay, such and such thing happened between them, but these are not our subject today. Rather, I will go for some other influences that helped Eliot to have a voice of his own, to get the fine tune that he later was a master on that particular way. If we read, because such an article is available online, the Paris Review interview of 1959 Eliot. So there Eliot is saying some of the brilliant ideas of his, how he started writing poetry, and who were the early influences on him, and his first meeting with W.B. Yeats, and how Yeats was always a man who used to give importance to all the upcoming writers, poets, and his long associations with Conrad Aiken, and so many a detailed interview in Paris Review online interview. We can have all those things, and there we find that how in this particular phase of 1910 and 1911, a very crucial time, that Eliot was also coming across the works of Laforgue and Charles Baudelaire. These two names we cannot miss while discussing Eliot, because Laforgue and Charles Baudelaire are those two very important names who were actually training Eliot to be a perfect, more perfect, and the best ever poet of his time. So he was continuously learning through the writings of Laforgue and Baudelaire. And not only that, at the same time he's getting the ideas, the experiences of modern life, industrial metropolis, in the writings, particularly Charles Baudelaire. And this very process of discovering was very vibrant, and he was reading voraciously the writings of Baudelaire and Laforgue. So if these are the Laforgue and their influences, then we need to go for again back to St. Louis, Missouri, because in my early section of my talk, I refer to how his childhood days were brilliant, and he was a privileged child, no doubt. At the same time, social distancing was well maintained in the Boston society that Eliot knew very well, because of their social position, because of that very cultural position in which Eliot was there was that kind of a social distance all the time. And his Milton Academy, where he was a student, later he went to Harvard, and this very social distance, this very psychological distance that he experienced all through, from where he could never get out of, rather he was there with him all the time. In the poetic persona of Eliot, we find that very sense of outsider, insider, always. Even when he was in Paris, even when he was back to his home, there is always that kind of a sense of outsider, insider. He's at the same time an outsider and tries to look into through that very approach of an insider. And even when he was an insider, he remains an outsider all through the kind of letter to Henry, that one remains a foreigner all the time. Rhapsody on a Windy Night and Preludes, we find how at the same time, like J. Alfred Proofwork, that reflections of the urban life. And this urban life reflection were so vehement. I am reading out a few lines from Preludes now. The winter evening settles down. We find that very, a kind of a, beginning almost, in case of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, look the very two different opening lines. One is, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. And in case of Prelude, we find the winter evening settles down, a kind of a long, long distance from someone. Someone is actually making himself, uh, you know, dissociated from the rest of the community. We are not trying to include Elliott's personal life all the time, but we have no choice. It is coming up. And that winter evening settles down with smell of sticks in passageways. The smell is there. Olfactory reflections are very much there. During this particular phase of lockdown, I had another talk on the color used by Elliot, how Elliot is continuously using different kind of colors and olfactory references, smells. According to Elliot, all are actually getting, fixed up in the brain and in a particular moment, and when a particular situation comes up, and then out of those long experiences of smell, color, situations, they gradually come up as influences of creative works. Smell of sticks in passageways, 6 o'clock. Time references are always there. Time is getting away. Time is passing away. It's nothing. Nothing is happening. So this very, ardent feeling is always there. We find times are there in Elliott's The Wasteland. I do remember that another section of The Wasteland there, Lil and his companions were in a kind of a restaurant, and the restaurant men, they are, announcing, hurry up, it's time, hurry up, it's time. And they are trying to talk a lot about Lil and Lil's husband, who was in the military and now is returning back to home. But when they are talking a lot about their personal discussions, and there are some of the problems that Lil was having, because he's getting old, even when she is not too old. So how to tackle the such kind of age and other related issues. So we find that the time is a recurrent motif in Eliot. Time is passing on. It's going away. It's getting oozing out. 6 o'clock. The burnt out ends of smoky days. Few lines are very common that you find not only in Preludes but also in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet. Look at the images. Withered leaves. So this is not a green leaf, something that is gone and no possibilities. So this very city image is something, this very dull image of the city, that's that boredom that we brilliantly find in case of Preludes. The sense of boredom is always there. Vacant lots, the showers beat the broken blinds and the chimney pots. Shower is of course very soothing. In physics, we know, those who had the experience of reading physics in class 2 level, we know that rain, sound of rain on a kind of a tin shed, it has a rhythm of its own. It has a beauty of its own. It has a soothing effect that can put you into lull, and it can make you sleep. But the kind of shower image we find, it is not a kind of a soothing shower. The rain image that you find here is broken blinds and chimney pots. The shower bit at the corner of the street. A lonely cab horse stems and stamps. Once again, I immediately connect the lonely cab throbbing, the reflection that we find in the wasteland, a taxi throbbing there, and in a violet hour, the typist girl was waiting for for her, you know, a male partner, and they had a physical intimacy. And then once the their exchange of feelings are done, what happens? The girl is again back to her loneliness, and the boy is again leaving her immediately. So this very city image, this very image of loneliness, monotony, the taxi throbbing in the wasteland, and the cab horse stems and stamps again for monotony, because the horse is stems and stamps, and it is because of the boredom. Boredom not on the part of the characters, boredom not on the parts of the human beings, rather boredoms on the part of the animals. And then the lighting of the lamps. Here the lighting of the lamps are the gas lights, and then of course it was the time of gas lights available there. And what happens when I see in my room, I often see every day the street lights that we have everywhere. If we just follow, one person is given the duty in different mafashal, that the man is assigned the duty of switching on the light in every poles. I used to see so many days ago, but not recently. uh, you know the same duty the man had every day, switching on the light when the evening is there. Every day just before the evening, the man is doing the very same kind of job, that very just like Sisyphus. The man has no Sunday, no Monday, nothing. Rather, he goes on lighting the lamps of the streets every day. Section 2, Preludes. The morning comes to consciousness of faint, stale smells of beer. Now, uh, the smell of beer, of course, it may be enchanting, but here the smell is stale. From the sawdust trampled street with all its muddy feet that press, early coffee stands with other masquerades, the time resumes, one thinks of all the hands that are raising dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. So these very reflections that Eliot personally had, that Eliot is actually he experienced, he saw, he witnessed that boredom of city life. Another thing regarding the boredom that I had in my talk, isolation and urban life. When I read Eliot, one thing also comes up, the sense of failure that we have already referred to while reading the love song of Alfred Proofwork. This sense of failure is very much there in Eliot. Now, of course, I am not directly trying to connect the sense of failure that we find in case of Alfred Proofwork. Rather, Proofwork is basically termed, and as all the critics or the critics that I have tried to consult, that Proofwork is a kind of a character who is an escapist, and he is in no way in a position to escape or meet the troubles of the everyday life. Rather, he prefers to escape from the troubles, and this escapism is very much there as a man like Folk. But if we think of Eliot, if we think of the kind of experiences that Eliot had, uh, and that the sense of failure is of course very much there, and that we cannot deny, because Eliot's early families, they were actually from England, and the four parents so many days ago, in the 17th century, they left England and went to America, and they settled in so many places of America. Now, Elliott's grandfather, who is actually a very successful man, uh, you know, he was a minister of church, and also has contribution in society in different ways. Now, this William Greenleaf Elliot was a kind of a man epitome of success. And it is a kind of an irony, no doubt, that when the seventh and the youngest child, Eliot, when he was born, on the very same year, William Greenleaf Eliot died. So uh, the kind of influence, direct influence that could have been on Eliot, it was not there. But Eliot was growing up, uh, knowing all about his grandfather, who was a man of success. Comparing with his parents, Eliot's father, Henry Ware Eliot, and his mother, Charlotte Champ Stearns. Now, in case of his father, Henry Ware Eliot was not a man of optimism, success, with a definite, goal and to reaching the goal. Rather, we find Henry Ware Eliot was the man of numerous possibilities. And the man was of numerous possibilities, and but he was not in no way success in any way. Most of his time he spent in music, the way music was the background in case of Milton's life too. I do remember Milton's father was a beautiful musician, and the music that you find in Milton was actually a direct influence of Milton's father. In case of Eliot, we find Eliot's father, Henry Ware Eliot, also had so many possibilities, but he was not in that true sense a successful man. Henry Ware Eliot spent most of his time music and sketching, painting in that way. And he was the kind of a man who sketched some beautiful sketches of cats. And probably those are the references that we find later on, and the famous book Old Possum's Book, written by Eliot on cat. So Eliot's father had brilliant sketches of numerous cat sketches. Now, on the part of Charlotte Stearns, Eliot's mother, now she was very promising. She has not so high, rather a very good academic upbringing at home, in schools too, and a very intelligent woman she was. But the kind of recognition she deserved, that she never had. And we find Charlotte Stearns a woman who had the kind of same sense of failure all the time. So what happens, Charlotte Stearns actually tried to impose the sense of success in the mind of her son, Thomas Stearns Eliot. So although all the unsuccessful career that Henry Eliot had and Charlotte Stearns had, it was particularly his mother Charlotte who nurtured her son so much and wanted to see uh, Eliot successful. Now, Eliot was growing up with that very sense of failure at home and the sense of, at the same time, uh, a kind of a pressure, no doubt, a kind of a all the time, a kind of a sense of, possibilities that he has to do something. The failure of his parents that had somehow his mother injected in his mind. Before I move further, I would like to uh, quote a few lines from a very interesting poem that is often overlooked, not read, not anthologized in that way. Because in this poem, we also find the speaker who is very much weary, reflecting that city life, very tired. A gentleman, but he's in a kind of a to and fro movement, and all the time he's actually dilling dallying and already troubled enough because of the boredom of the city life. A very short poem, and the name of the poem is The Boston Evening Transcript. It is very short. The readers of Boston Evening Transcript sway in the wind like a field of ripe corn. When evening quickens faintly in the street, weakening the appetites of life in some, and to others bringing the Boston Evening Transcript. I mount the steps and ring the bell, turning warily, as one would turn to nod goodbye to Rochefoucauld. If the street were time and he at the end of the street, and I say, Cousin Harriet, here is the Boston Evening Transcript. So this very few short poem and the few lines, and the poem is already over. It's not at all a light verse, rather a text very much, a matter of fact, talks a lot about the uncomfortable quality of the speaker's weariness. And the poem is a kind of a, early reference of the later date poems, Preludes, and the love song of J. Alfred Proofwork, the despairing vision of the contemporary urban life, the seamy-side, the boredom, that is one of the major subjects in Eliot's writing. So this is how Eliot is actually trying to connect the experiences in one hand, the city images in one hand, and his vast reading on the other, and creating all those characters in such a way that we find in Gerontion, in the hollow men, we have the same kind of hollowness of existence, same kind of hollowness in thought. So it is the kind of at the same time, I will go further to say a kind of a spiritual barrenness that we find in Eliot. Now, the next thing that I would like to include here is the ideas of Bradley, because for a long time, Eliot had to consult Bradley because he continued his PhD for a long time and it remained incomplete or semi-complete. The story is something like that. His long associations with F.H. Bradley's philosophy and his PhD thesis on Bradley. And then in the meantime, he left, made it a kind of a pause, went to Europe, settled there, and that hasty marriage that we cannot deny. Uh, and then he again continued and completed the thesis. But when it was scheduled to submit, at that time there was the World War, and the kind of journey that was planned to reach America, the journey was cancelled, and so the thesis was not submitted in time. However, Howard accepted it later on, and he was given the honorary PhD. So that Bradleyan thought was very much in Eliot, and he was nurtured with that very same kind of thought. Now, in one of the essays, Hamlet and His Problems, and so many other essays, uh, if we go through, we find some of those that way I referred to early in my talk, that sense of impersonality that was very much in them. And also we find the theory of objective correlative. Now, the kind of references Eliot is actually formulating, we find this objective correlative is nothing but an outward manifestation of the inward things. So what do I mean by the outward manifestation of the inward things? The kind of lines I read out from the Yellow Fog in the love song of Geoffrey Pufok, it talks a lot about the social environment, the murkiness, and the conditions all through. So Eliot's feeling is dual. He is in one way insider and the other way an outsider. The very same thing we find in Rhapsody on a Windy Night. Madman shaking a dead geranium, it gives the reader a kind of a vivid image and the sense of, once again, objective correlative. A turmoil of disconnected mind and the sense of proportion, and all are juxtaposed all through. In Love Song of Geoffrey Pufok, such kind of objective correlatives are all true. But these objects, these images are the results of his long troubles that one person who could identify well, to whom the wasteland was dedicated, Il Magliar Fabro, the better craftsman, no other than Ezra Pound. It was Ezra Pound to whom Eliot met for the first time timidly, and gave some of the poems like Portrait of a Lady and the Love Song of Geoffrey Pufok for a kind of a perusal. And Ezra Pound, turned over the pages and found those are simply gems. Immediately, Ezra Pound forwarded the poems to Harriet Monroe, the editor of Poetry magazine, and put that very brilliant remark. Eliot has sent in the best poem I have yet had or seen from an American. I quote from Ezra Pound. He has actually trained himself and modernized himself on his own. And what was brilliant in Eliot was the new voice. The new voice that we are talking so long since the beginning of the talk, by this long experience, by these long associations with people, visiting so many places, uh, now Eliot has gradually developed that kind of a voice that he was searching for a long time. Because Eliot somewhere told that one need to be different. One needs to be different, a kind of a genuinity, because you cannot be very common. And if you are common, you will be unidentified. So this newness of voice is now developed. And modernizing himself on his own means a kind of lots of dedication on the part of Eliot. It was a kind of a long journey. Even his own personal nervous breakdown, he had to face all those phases. So now if we look this very Proofwork, this Proofwork is a different Proofwork. A man who is looking at the society, the city from a different angle. Proofwork is a satire on Boston society. And Eliot himself has said somewhere that quite uncivilized but refined beyond the pint of civilization. What city, what kind of city we find there? Van Wyck Brooks described the city that we find in Proofwork is congested with learning, hypercritical, concerned, self-conscious, filled with sad desiccation. So the character Proofwork that we find here, Proofwork is very much a product of this milieu. And of course, a result of Eliot's vast reading. And now it is clear, now it is very much known that, and another reference that he is getting is from Henry James's fiction. Delicacy, subtlety, malaise, and neurosis. So this Proofwork is the result of that very 19th century Boston society. Like many of James's protagonists, the kind of Proofwork we find is timid, fastidious, and he is afraid of action. What does he desire? He desires experience, but he is unable to surrender. Now, Eliot as a poet, the kind of voice now he has gained is the result of his surrendering to poetry all through every possible way. Until or unless we surrender, nothing will come up. And here, obviously, Tagore's that very brilliant poem in Bengali, Kripon, it has brilliant translations also. So we need to surrender, and then the actual will come. But Proofwork is the representative of those fastidious, timid society men, city men, who are unable to surrender. William Blake also had a very famous saying. You know, he who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. So if someone desires to do something, he must have to surrender. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Now, in Proofwork, we find the reference of Frederick Monroe, the hero of Flaubier's Education Sentimentale, and the kind of Eliot's observation of Frederick that we find in Flaubier's text is very much the condition of Proofwork that we find here. Constructed partly by a negative definition, built up by a great number of observations, we cannot isolate him from the environment. When I am reading out the Elliots observation on Frederick, Frederick cannot be isolated from the environment. So is the very same case in case of Proofwork. It may be an environment which is or can be much universalized, and the figure in it consists of a very many observed particular facts. The actual world, without this world the figure dissolves. The rolling faculty is a critical perception, a commentary upon experienced feelings and sensation. So Proofwork no doubt himself is isolated, but we cannot isolate Proofwork. And the landscape that you find in the poem, The Love Song of Alfred Proofwork, is nothing but the, temporal city, a modern temporal city, and that is very much a kind of same reflection that we find in Dante's medieval Inferno. So here is a very good parallel in between the two. But the most important thing is the sense of inactivity, sense of boredom, and sense of distrust, which are very much there. And another thing that we would like to connect is the title, The Love Song of J. Alfred Proofwork, that also talks about Guido da Montefeltro's reference in Dante's Inferno. So once again, Guido's reference talks a lot about the sense of uncertainty, the sense of disbelief that is very much there in Proofwork. The same sense of disbelief that we find all the time. I have something more to say on the new monologue technique that has also been gained by Eliot in case of Proofwork, but at the same time, this uncertainty and that squalid society we can find in Preludes. Section 3, you tossed a blanket from the bed. You lay upon your back and waited. You dozed and watched the night, revealing the thousand sordid images of which your soul was constituted. They flickered against the ceiling. All the world came back and the light crept up between the shutters. You heard the sparrows in the gutter. You had such a vision of the street, and the street hardly understands, sitting along the bed edge where you curl the papers from your hair or clasp the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. Now in section 3 of Prelude, we find the only line of hope, sparrows in the gutter. Except this one, we find the light crept up between the shutters. The vision of street hardly understands. So it is a kind of a reflection of street that is, very hard nut to crack. A kind of a environment and the city that is not at all understandable. And you doze. Boredom, frustration, unhappiness, without finding a proper goal or an aim in life, because you have thousand sordid images of the last night. Each and every section of Prelude, the 4 sections, were written in 4 different times, in different places. And later, Eliot combined them all and tried to make a kind of a, balance or a kind of meanings that we find chronologically now 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it gets into a kind of a perfect meaning chronologically. But actually, these four sections had four different time period, timeline in four different places that Eliot had. Once again, I would like to refer to Baudelaire and other writers and their references, which are very much there in the poem. Now, the dramatic monologue with which I would like to make an end, because Eliot is such a vast ocean, uh, it is very difficult to complete within 1.5 hours. Now, dramatic monologue is something that all the students, to my students, to whom I am addressing this lecture, uh, that it was initiated by Robert Browning and so many other contemporaries of Browning, Tennyson. We find the references of dramatic monologue, no doubt. But the interesting fact is that Eliot made a kind of a modifications of this dramatic monologue. He put it a kind of a twist. Dramatic monologue in Victorian period was a kind of a reaction against the confessional style of the Romantic poetry. Eliot made a twist. In Eliot's poems, the distinction between subject and the object is blurred. The kind of blurred journey we find in the opening section in Proofwork's journey, a kind of a blurred vision, insidious streets that follow like tedious arguments, overwhelming questions. These blurred areas are very much there. But to whom that Eliot really address and is very much indebted to for this twisted version of monologue is no other than Jules Lafog. And he is primarily indebted to him. And when Eliot was a student, undergraduate student at Harvard, and it was the time that he started reading Lafog, and I quote from that early memories and references to Eliot, he was engrossed in working out the implications of Lafog. And it was the new discovery of Eliot then that Lafog had invented a new kind of monologue. And that is adapted by Eliot later on. And what was the new kind of monologue that we find in Lafog? That was interior monologue. And not only interior monologue, it was a kind of an auto-irony. So, throughout the text, we find this auto-irony is very much there. The character is making an irony of himself, that his hands are getting thin and he's actually, getting dull and nothing. If we read the last few lines of Eliot, the love song of Alfred Proofwork, not I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant lord, auto-irony. One that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt, an easy tool. Differential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse. At times, indeed, almost ridiculous. Here are the examples of auto-irony. Almost at times the fool. I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? When someone is so serious in tone and is talking about that I grow old, we find the very sense of auto-irony. Shall I part my hair behind? When your hair is thin, we know, if we read Sunil Gangobadhyay's friend Tarapada Rai's, that comic stories, that Kautuk Nokshas, very well, that we can find when someone is having less hair on head, what are the different ways one can have, cover the head. In Sanjeev Chattopadhyay, the famous Bengali writer, we have also the same kind of auto irony, the irony of covering the head. eh? Sriti to Kuthak, such kind of little hair and the back side of the head, how he is actually making nomenclature of different kind of portions of hair. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaid singing each to each. So this very escapism from that sordid city life is that very reflection that we find all through the love song of G. Alfred Prufrock, and also the kind of squalid, dirty city and the experiences, and a kind of a answer, or an attempt, where Eliot is not giving any definite answer in case of the preludes, with which the preludes end. So that's all from my end. Thank you so much. It's up to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insightful thoughts and ideas. I'm sure the students are extremely enriched by everything that you had to say on Eliot, as well as the faculty members. I think to begin with, it was really interesting that you connected Eliot with the pandemic situation. As a matter of fact, when I read the title, the first thing that came to my mind was this boredom and isolation, the way we are trapped in, cut away from the world. So in a way, I think we are all, preparing our faces to meet the different faces on the road in the days to come. So I would just like to sum up in very short whatever important and key points that Professor has mentioned. And there were so many points that I was totally at a loss. I was trying to jot down almost everything, but I'll try to keep it short. So he begins with how extremely important these categories of modern urban experiences are: the very shock and the anonymity and the fragmentation of the modern life, the alienating effects of modern life that we can trace in poems like Proofwork and Preludes. He talked about the problematic position of T.S. Eliot's personal life, how he was a late child in the family, and also his position in the society, which kind of made him an insider as well as an outsider at the same time, to become a foreigner, a kind of stranger in the city that he has come to live. So I think all of these kind of got reflected in the poems that he wrote. He also talked about urbanity. Urbanity, I think, is very important, because when we talk about space, we are actually trying to say that space is not just an empty space. It consists of the objects and the individuals who are, in a way, constantly trying to negotiate with the space. So that was there. And what else I found interesting was the idea of the threat of the city. And like he said, that a city is something which is supposed to provide you with some sort of comfort, with some sort of protection. But then there are moments when that city itself, the very, let's say, the familiar space becomes unfamiliar before you. So that is something which, appears again and again in Eliot's poem. Then he also spoke about how reading and different lectures had shaped Eliot's mind and bent of writing. And he actually referred to a number of scholars and writers. And it would have been really nice if we could have taken a note of all of them, because he really mentioned some important articles and writers and how they had influenced Eliot. He also talked about memory, sexual deprivation, and desires. and the ecclesiastical references of how to give shape to such desires, the internal process of arguments, the sense of doubt, the sense of failure, and of course, he ended the lecture with objective, correlative, auto-irony, and internal monologue, all these concepts which he tried to analyze through these two poems, which are a part of today's lecture. So, thank you, sir. It was really interesting to be a
Thank
part
you.
of
Thank you
this
so much.
session. And I
Thank
think
you.
this small session, it opens up different other scopes for our, for example,
Yes.
you talked about mind mapping. You also mentioned architecture. And other than T.S. Eliot, I think Virginia Woolf, Walter Benjamin, they are also writers who had, occupied themselves in similar areas. So I thought that was interesting as
Yes.
well. Um,
Yes. Yes.
so I think we have a flurry of questions awaiting from the students as well as maybe
Okay.
from one or two faculty members. So I'll try to take as many as I can. Um, so the first question is from um, Sweetie Parui. No, we're going with Sweetie Parui. Sir, is it because of the rapid urbanization of the world that T.S. Eliot ends up saying one always remains a foreigner? So she's actually dealing with the
Yeah.
foreigner
Yeah.
question that I mentioned.
Yes, 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 yes. So, thank you that you are, it's a kind of observation, I think, not a question in that way. That no doubt, Eliot's this journey to and fro from Europe, from America to Europe and different cities, countries of Europe, that you also find that in case of another writer that I have referred to, Henry James, that was very much there. And Eliot, as an author, as a writer, as a poet, as an essayist, uh, he found that in spite of being a part of London, that he wanted to be a part of London very much, but that being a part and not being a part in toto, that made him think that one becomes a foreigner all the time. And he was really so, that his hasty marriage and his job in bank, and also the nervous breakdown and help from Ezra Pound, and later this Ezra Pound himself a patient and was sent to an asylum. So all through, and later he found that it is actually a kind of a journey. Is it that Eliot is actually trying to give the message that it is not only in Eliot's case but in our case too? In our case too, actually, we are also foreigners. So we grow up someplace, and then we get settled somewhere, and then we do our job somewhere, and then we don't know where to uh, go for the end. So it is true, very much true for our cases too. We are also foreigners in the very same way, though it was in the case of Eliot.
We move on to the next question. This is from Ipshita Bej, and she asked, "What is the mood of the poem Love Song of Alfred Prufrock?"
Would you please repeat what is the mood?
What is the mood of the poem, the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock?
Okay, the mood is, of course, various moods. There is no single mood. That I also mentioned that Eliot was the man having a vast reading, because the Milton School, then Hubbard, and then he went to Paris, and then again he was back to America. So this long journey and the vast reading, the classical training, and also the philosophical training. He started reading all the Hindu religious scriptures, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and then Bhagavad Gita, everything that he read, and even Patanjali. Even I found a brilliant material in which he was also reading Patanjali and text of Patanjali. So actually, the mood that we find in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is not mono, rather multi, because different moods, and there is no single voice. The I and the we in the opening lines are not, who is the I and who is the we is a very big question, and there is no definite answer. Eliot actually wanted to keep his poems open-ended, and there should not be any particular answer in that case. So The mood is also often, it is pessimistic, often ray of hope, often indecision, often anxiety, often a kind of a self-satisfaction, often lethargy. So, in a nutshell, my answer would be it is of various moods. No definite mood is there, but of course, a kind of a critical view to society and culture that you primarily find in Eliot.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Rimpa Mondol and Makshuda Khatun, and both of them have asked more or less in the similar lines. So I'm just connecting them together. In the 21st century, what is the overwhelming question that T.S. Eliot is trying to address in the poem? The overwhelming question that comes up in the discussion.
The overwhelming question that you are, thank you, both of you, because you are trying to connect Eliot to 21st century. And in the 21st century, if we think of reading of Eliot in our time, are we really devoid of the same kind of overwhelming question that we find today? Rather, in my reading of Eliot, I all the time think that Eliot is so much relevant. The kind of questions that Eliot actually addressed to the readers are similarly relevant, similarly practical. And we find that the same overwhelming questions that young generations of our time, their decisions and indecisions, they are of course taking some good decisions, but often some indecisions that we find in social media, that we find in newspaper, that we find in national level, that in international level. So these are the decisions, and the indecisions are very much there. Impatience, anxiety are in an extreme way. The kind of impatience we find in the writings of Eliot, in the characters, in the narrator, in the speakers in Eliot, they are impatient, no doubt, but the impatience is growing up more and more. So I think Eliot is the relevant questions of Eliot are very much there, and of course we need to read and read it Eliot more and more, because Eliot hasn't given certain answer in that way. We don't find an answer in case of the love song of Alfred Proofwork. We don't find any answer in case of Preludes, but we find a little bit of answer in case of the Wasteland, because the Western civilization and the degradation and that kind of overhaul, catastrophic end or the gradual decay, the answer is in a kind of the Oriental philosophies, that kind of datta, dayadham, dhammata, that we need to submit. We need to surrender. We need to go have a kind of a go for a particular fixing up of our mind and aim. That probably is the answer in 21st century reading of T.S. Eliot, and that is my answer.
Thank you. The next question is again from two students, Shri Krishna Mahato and Sahina Khatun, and they ask, what is the effect of repeating these words like yellow and window pane again and again, especially in line 15 to 22?
Thank you. The answer is very much clear. The repetition is always there in Eliot, and repetition directly connects us boredom. Repeating the same thing, that means one gets the same image all the time, means one is not doing anything. So on the part of the speaker who is repeating the same words, same images, the fog, the yellow fog is coming repeatedly. So it's a kind of a thing that the speaker is not doing. That's why he is having the same kind of scene all the time, and which means this very boredom is actually there. This repetitions means boredom.
I think this is the same thing you said about time at the beginning of your lecture, how time is more like this endless loop and not linear or chronological anymore. So it's perhaps that repetition. Yeah. So moving on to the next question. This is from Ontim Bera, who says, why is he comparing his life with a coffee spoon? The very famous quotation that we all remember.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. So I would like to read out with all of you that life with a coffee spoon lines,
Yes,
Uh,
it has been the favorite of almost all the undergraduate students, and this
yes,
remains with
yes,
us almost
yes,
forever.
yes. I have measured up my life. Yes, it is around 39, 40, 50, 51, 52. I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a farther room. So, how should I presume? I would like to explain this particular section in the context of that timid, indecisive, uh, disheartened Proofwork, and he knows all those people means all the society of men. He is curious to have a conversation with them, but somehow a kind of an inertia provokes him all the time not to move further. So I have measured out my life with coffee spoon is actually, in my interpretation, it would be something like that. That you know, just like the coffee spoon, he is actually having that very small amount of courage, small amount of confidence, or the life it's so timid, so in that sense, not having that uh, uh, guts on the part. Rather, the life on the part of Proofwork is something that is measured by a coffee spoon, and it is so volatile. It is so uh, small amount of that it cannot do something great. Rather, this measuring life with coffee spoon would necessarily reflects the idea that life has very little meaning to him. Life is something, a kind of a partial living, a shadowy living that we often find in Eliot, life in dead and death in life. So, in spite of having a living life, the Proofwork is actually leading a life that is almost like a dead. Even being alive, he is living a life of a dead. So this measured with coffee spoon, not with a bowl, or not with a larger spoon, that means he would just like to pass out the life, and that's okay. That's my interpretation.
Thank you, sir. The next question is a bit complicated one. In a sense, perhaps it will take two different classes, but I would still read it out. It's from Shubhoshri Dandapat, who says, how would you analyze the poem from a feminist and psychoanalytic perspective? So I understand if you would like to pass the question because it really demands two separate classes, but
Yes,
they are
yes,
really
yes, yes, yes,
enthusiastic
yes.
about.
It's
Uh,
yeah. Uh, I wouldn't elaborate, but of course, this text can be read from the feminist angle. I am just trying to just point out some of the portions that, uh, you know, in the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo, and some of the references that the way Eliot has written over there, that I know the woman, and formulated phrases, those eyes of the women, and the arms and the braceleted arms, white and bare. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? And so many other references are there which can actually help us a lot to read the text from a feminist angle. I think you are right to point out that we can have a separate lecture for this, and that will be no doubt an interesting one. So, no doubt, Eliot's observation on women and was there. Uh, and the kind of all the time we are saying of the a kind of sexual uh, 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 frustration on the part of the speaker. I would like to quote from my memory, somewhere Eliot said that I had only two happiness. One was that he was saying of uh, publishing a poem or reading something, and the another one was his second marriage. So women and marriage, women and life, women and society, the way Eliot wanted to attempt at, uh, it requires a separate reading, no doubt.
Yes.
Before Vivian Haywood and the second marriage that he had with his secretary, during his Harvard days, Eliot had another, woman with whom he fell in love. So, but what we find, Eliot's position to addressing women was no doubt full of questions, full of uh, uh, happiness and unhappiness in both cases actually. And no doubt I would like to include here the influence of Eliot's mother. Actually, it was Eliot's mother who had a very serious nod on Eliot's life, because he praised him all the time to complete the PhD. You have to complete
Right.
the PhD. And of course, when Eliot is already uh, separated from the first wife Vivian Haywood, Vivian was in regular contact with him and trying to harass him. I'm using the word harass. It is not my word. It is one of the biographers' word I am just quoting here. Vivian Haywood harassed him continuously, and it continued when around 58 years old, when Vivian Haywood died of heart attack. So his attitude to a man, his feminist stance was full of questions, and I will be happy to talk later on in somewhere, or I will be interested to have a kind of a reading of my own on this
Yes.
particular angle. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully, we'll have another session on this. And I'll just take one more question from the students, although we have a lot of them waiting. But this is from Ria Manna. And she says, why does Eliot believe the modern world was so nearly antithetical to the creation of art? Why Eliot believes that the modern world was so nearly antithetical to the creation of art?
I don't think. Is it somewhere? Not exactly, I think. Eliot, of course, modern was antithetical. I do support, I do admit this particular point, but it is antithetical to creation, not like that. That is my
Yes, maybe
opinion, my
not so
personal opinion,
reductive.
of course. Yes, yes. Brother Eliot wanted to get information, material, sources, impulses, and even inspiration. Once again, I am requoting the reference, or rephrasing that particular information that I just said, that his hasty marriage was decided within of 2 or 3 months only. And what was the idea that was in his mind? That Vivian Haywood will inspire him. Vivian Haywood would be the would be that very muse, that image of a muse. And it was also on the part of Vivian Haywood that she could inspire T.S. Eliot. But unfortunately, it didn't happen so. So,
Right.
and Eliot knew it very well that modern world is antithetical, but it is that very sources from where one can create something new. And we need antithesis, because if everything is so, if everything is so good, so no creation would be there. Through antithesis we create. When
Right.
problems are there, we try to write something new, and then the new poetry, a new novel, a play comes up. Every play means every problem. No problem, no play. Every poem must have an antithetical idea. And if there is no problem in a play or in a poem, it is not a poetry at all. It is not a play at all. That's all.
Thank you, sir, for being answering all the
Thank you.
questions so patiently. Thank you, students, for the questions. I'm sure you have got your answers right. And we'll take just one question from the faculty, Swata Das, who is my colleague, and she takes a very deep interest in T.S. Eliot. So I would ask Swata if you could just ask your question to sir. Swata, are you there?
Yes, yes. Am I audible?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Good morning, sir. At the very
Good
beginning,
morning.
I would like to, yes, I would like to thank you for this very engaging session. Me
Thank
personally,
you.
being very interested in Eliot, this gave me a new opportunity, and I was very much eager to put my question in front of you. Please excuse me because this is just a longish question, and this is more or less on the philosophical perspective that I want to gain from you. Baudelaire had said that the poet is a seer, and we know to the degree and extent to which Eliot was influenced or indebted to Baudelaire, to philosophy, to the poetic philosophy of Baudelaire. So, in very many literature history books, particularly by McCoy and Harlan, we find that Proofrock the poem and Proofrock the character, both of them have been called as exemplifying or epitomizing the modern frustration. Now, Prufrock in his poem, he wants to disturb the universe. He wants to introduce chaos into the order of the conventional world, where opinions and prejudices, they castrate him. They make him unable to ask that overwhelming question again and again. So if we are to bring in here a very critical perspective of Georg Lukács, who had said in his essay that all modernity, that is the sensibility of modernism, all modernity is the necessary condition for modernism. Like it has to be there. This anguish has to be there if we are to herald the era of so-called herald the era of modernism. Lukács does say that, and Lukács does quite vehemently criticizes Eliot in his essay. So, if we are to bring in that perspective, then can we call Eliot elitist or somewhat esoteric, given that he has the advantage of that poetic imagination that the common people, we, if I am to call ourselves the common people, we do not have. So he stands on that pedestal, that position of advantage, where he can use his poetic imagination to express himself. But if Prufrock epitomizes the modern individual, then where do we fall in this circle? Uh, doesn't he become an elitist or quite esoteric in that sense? This is my question.
Okay, thank you. Uh, my point observation is brilliant. Thank you for this brilliant observation. And my point will be at the same time, uh, no doubt, there is no doubt that Prufrock is actually the reflection of an age that was full of frustration. And Lucas's commentary on Eliot, uh, of course, it was his own personal viewpoints, but if we read Eliot's Prufrock and other observations, and particularly the love song of Geoffrey Prufrock, then we find that it is the kind of uh, hitting the environment, because I referred in my talk that how he was actually trying to make a voice that was new, the kind of new message that he had in mind, and he would like to make a kind of a uh, you know uh, new kind of approach that he was planning to do for a long time. It may be in case of the internal monologue, the twisting, and the auto irony. And at the same time, if we think of before Eliot, there was no definite in that kind of a questioning of the time. I would like to, having your question, I would like to readdress the kind of topic that I had in mind that I just mentioned in my talk, the Paris Review interview, when Eliot was asked the very same question. Now, the interviewer was asking him that nowadays, someone is asking a upcoming poet that who is your uh, you know uh, under whose guidance, under whose influence you are writing. So we have poets like T.S. Eliot, we have poets like so many others. But when Eliot was writing poetry, whom Eliot was found as their, in that way, uh, uh, supreme position, under whose influences he was writing on. Eliot was there to say, though, I didn't find anyone who can actually make a new kind of voice, make a new kind of thing. The kind of continuity of thought that Eliot faced during his time, Eliot wanted to make a kind of a break. Eliot wanted to kind of a question, addressing a new kind of a challenge that since his time was there on, because the kind of confessional trend on the part of the poet, he wanted to make a kind of a new turn in that way. So now what Lucas is actually saying, the frustration and all about the issues or the critical views of his on Eliot and the Proofwork, is my take is that uh, I must say that this was Eliot's philosophical trend, not only of his own personal anguish, own personal journey, own personal trauma, but also the trauma of a generation that people of his time couldn't capture well. Only some occasional references were there. And out of those occasional references, Eliot was the strong voice with a new structure, with a new multi-voiced, identity. He tried to make a new kind of beginning, and the new beginning was, of course, of his own. So the kind of frustration he wanted to capture of his generation, it was unique. And of course, Lucas's observation is welcome, because everyone must have his own approaches. But my angle is that the kind of frustration Eliot wanted to capture in Proofwork or in so many other poems was actually genuine, because before Eliot, except some occasional voice, no other strong voices were there to make this new kind of beginning. So for this new kind of beginning, the necessity of Eliot was there, and Eliot actually did so brilliantly and successfully.
True that, sir. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer, sir.
Thank you, sir. We have finally reached the end of the session. And once again, thanks a lot for being with us, for answering the questions and enriching the students with all the informations and ideas. And I'm sure this opens space for more discussions, but maybe for some other day. So we'll just go back to where we started. I'll pass it on to Professor Bashav Datta Ghosh to deliver the vote of thanks to the professor. Bashav Datta.
Thank you, Anona ma'am. It was really a privilege listening to you, sir. The way you have connected Eliot's personal life, the alienations among his childhood, and also this shift from USA to United Kingdom, and then to and fro, and how all those issues have influenced him to such kind of poetry, and specifically how you used the term boredom and you connected with it to our present condition. And I think that is the fulfillment of reading literature, how we can read a poetry which was written almost 100 years ago, and we are relating that to our present situation. I feel that our students are very much enriched by your lecture, and that is pretty much evident in the insightful questions that they asked you. You have actually taken them far with Eliot, and I think this would give them a new kind of enthusiasm to read Eliot. Thank you again. Thank you on behalf of our entire department. Thank you, sir. for giving us time,
Thank you, madam.
for giving such a wonderful and insightful, enlightening lecture to our students. It was an honor listening to you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you once again. I would like to
Thank you so
thank
much.
our principal, Dr. Devashish Pal, who has always been with us and supported us in all our endeavors. I would like to thank our head of the department, Mr. Shondip Kumar Dolui. I would like to thank all my colleagues who have worked so hard to make this endeavor a success. And last but not the least, I would like to thank our students who have been such patient and enthusiastic listeners. And I'm sure you have learned a lot from Sir's lecture, which you will be incorporating in your studies in future. Thank you, all of you, for staying with us, for listening to our lecture. We will be having our next lecture today in the evening at 7 p.m. Stay with us. That's all for now. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, all of you. Once again, that's all for
Thank you.
now.